It is difficult to imagine the Napoleonic period without thinking of French cavalry thundering across the battlefields of Europe, led by such enigmatic characters as Murat, Lasalle, de Hautpoul, and Colbert, to name but a few. As a key part of La Grande Armée, the French cavalry came to be regarded as the finest in all of Europe, their charges winning battles and their vigorous pursuits entire campaigns. However, this fine reputation was hard-earned because prior to the revolution, woeful neglect meant that its exploits for the early part of the wars left much to be desired. In the following video, I'm going to examine just what it was that enabled the French cavalry to become the eyes, ears, and thunderous battering ram of La Grande Armée, looking at each class of cavalry, showcasing their battlefield maneuvers, the keys to their success, as well as showing examples of their prowess in action. Man and horse have been united on the battlefield for thousands of years, with almost all armies utilizing them in varying capacities. Some preferred lighter cavalry, often armed with bows and usually displaying individual equestrian prowess, able to harass the enemy both during and after the battle. The Mongolian cavalry, the Polish horsemen, and the Mamelukes are just a few examples that spring to mind. In contrast, other nations and armies preferred heavier cavalry, large men on large horses, the most famous example being knights clad in heavy plate armour. These horsemen relied on formation and mass as opposed to pure horsemanship, breaking enemy lines and winning many a battle and even more accolades. Although most armies tended to use a varying mix of both types, with the invention of the firearm, adopted by cavalry in the form of pistols and small musketoons, heavier armoured cavalry began to fall out of vogue. Armour was not as effective in protecting against gunpowder, nor did its inflexibility enable ease of use for these new weapons. However, the Swedish king, Gustavus Adolphus, quickly realised that these weapons were no match for infantry armed with muskets, and he thus sought to return the shock action to his cavalry. Drawing on his experience of aggressive Polish lancers, the king taught his light cavalry to charge home at the gallop with swords drawn. Pistols were now definitely the secondary weapon. Although they had never truly gone away, Gustavus's battlefield success marked a return to form for shock cavalry, and whilst within 2 centuries cavalry would become void as a force on the battlefield almost entirely, there was still plenty of time for great deeds to be accomplished from horseback. In the wars of the mid-18th century, the prestige and glamour which had always attached to the mounted arm had been enhanced by the achievements of the Prussian cavalry under von Seilitz. In Frederick the Great's army, the cavalry charges had always been led by magnificent heavy regiments, whose troopers all wore the cuirass, whilst the hussars followed on behind to gather up the prisoners. Although renowned for his infantry, many of Frederick the Great's famous victories owed much to his cavalry, especially his heavy cavalry led by Friedrich Wilhelm von Seilitz, a fabulous cavalry general who possessed much courage and initiative, and whose well-timed actions often swung the balance of battle in favour of the Prussians. Frederick in fact gave his cavalry much leeway in their decisions during a battle. To his cavalry in action, Frederick gave no orders beyond the general directions as to which part of the field it was to act in. The moment for attack was always left to the generals commanding the cavalry, who, after securing their flanks and providing a reserve, spurred and started, and being once started, they pushed on while there was an enemy in the field. By allowing his cavalry commanders such autonomy, it enabled them to better time their charges, to catch the enemy, be it cavalry or infantry, at a point when their morale was shaken and opportunities beckoned. However, without taking anything away from both Frederick or von Seilitz, it must be remembered that during this period, known as linear warfare, infantry fought in long lines, and generals therefore sought open plains for their battles to make best use of this. Artillery was also still not at its full potency. This meant that cavalry was able, in most cases, to observe much of the battlefield with a single glance, and better able to assess where they could make their mark. In contrast, by the end of the century, battles were becoming larger, and were often fought in all sorts of terrain, not just open plains. Infantry had also become more self-reliant, and as a result were also more comfortable in dealing with enemy cavalry. Artillery too was finally coming into its own, with a growing mobility which only helped to improve its potency. All of this meant that cavalry, while still extremely effective, faced more potential danger, and going forward would have to pick its moments with much more care and attention. Readers of British history, particularly through the mentioning of battles such as Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, are given the impression that the French were famous for their cavalry, particularly given the prominent role they always played in these battles. Perhaps they are, but there are several figures who don't regard the French as particularly good horsemen at all. The French had, at times, a numerous cavalry, but it was deplorably deficient in discipline, and when they had a few good squadrons, they evidently knew not how to use them. Good horses were scarce, and they had neither the patience nor the money to train the mounted soldier as he must be trained, ere he can be serviceable in war. In fact, as a nation, the French are not, and have never been, truly equestrian. Generally they are bad riders, and without good riding there can be no thoroughly good horse soldier. Whilst Captain Nolan, yes, the same Captain Nolan from the infamous charge of the Light Brigade, may be showing a sense of national bias here, he wasn't the only one who felt this way. During the Napoleonic period, probably the pinnacle for French cavalry, the Austrian Archduke Charles described the French as awkward horsemen, and Jomini, who served both the French and later the Allies, concludes with something similar. When I speak of excellent French cavalry, I refer to its impetuous bravery and not to its perfection, for it does not compare with the Russian or German cavalry either in horsemanship, organisation, or in care of the animals. These negative views may at first seem surprising, but the historian David Johnson suggests that there was perhaps a natural explanation for this. Since the greater part of their soil was cultivated with the use of oxen, France traditionally produced neither born horsemen nor hommes de cheval, and the French trooper's slipshod methods of looking after his horse were complemented by bad organisation. Despite this, on the eve of the Revolution, the French still boasted about 33,000 horsemen, constituting about a fifth of their total army, which was not a bad size. For comparison, Napoleon aimed the French army to consist of about 1/6 cavalry, although for several of his battles he did manage to exceed this. Therefore, the French cavalry numbers were admirable heading towards the end of the century, but it was their quality which was of concern. Although military debates held in the years after the conclusion of the 7 Years' War had seen many improvements in both the infantry and the artillery, the cavalry was the only arm that did not witness a marked organisational and tactical improvement. In fact, in the decade leading up to the Revolution, French cavalry officers were concerned about the prospect of a war which would mean them facing off against superior Austrian or Prussian cavalry. Although they had adopted Frederick's method of delivering the charge, their tactics were still lacking, and many manoeuvres were done at the halt. During the last half of the Ancien regime, French mounted regiments established a mediocre record. On the eve of the Revolution, they were clearly no match for the cavalry of Prussia, Austria, and England. Unfortunately, the Revolution, when it came in 1789, was to only make things even worse. Being descendant of the knights of old, the cavalry was always viewed as the most noble arm, and it therefore naturally attracted the upper classes and aristocracy, seeking to prove themselves from horseback in the same fashion as their ancestors. Thus, the birth of the Republic, and what it represented, predictably presented problems. The first came when much of the nobility fled France, hitting the cavalry the hardest, depriving her of many of her best officers, and even some of the soldiers who fled with their commanders. For those who chose to remain loyal to France, even some of these faced issues because they often held ties, no matter how minor, to the old regime. These men were rooted out and either demoted, or if less fortunate, sent to visit Madame Guillotine. Under the monarchy, the mounted arm had always attracted a high proportion of young noblemen, and the flight of the émigrés at the outbreak of the Revolution had cost France some of her best cavalry officers. Many more had been killed in action or disgraced on political grounds. The second problem was that, being linked so heavily with the old regime which had just been deposed, the cavalry arm was naturally looked down upon by the new republic, and whilst the infantry and artillery received many fresh volunteers, the cavalry was left wanting. Therefore, when faced with war and dwindling numbers, the Directory had to step in, forcing recruits into the cavalry. By late 1794, these measures had bulked the cavalry to over 100,000 strong, which although impressive was still a long way from solving the problems the French faced. Unsurprisingly, cavalry require horses, and that was something that the French lacked. As already noted, their main beast of burden was the oxen, and what horse breeding programs they did have were once again hurt by the Revolution. Under the Revolution, the royal breeding studs had been abolished, and 1,116 magnificent stallions sold off, a crippling blow from which it took the French horse production a long time to recover. The Directory attempted to get around this by requisitioning all horses that they could, but this still didn't solve the issue because horses, like men, require training before they are fit for combat. The army horse destined for combat had to be trained for manoeuvres and familiarised with the sounds of war. In this respect, Instructions for the Manoeuvres of Mounted Troops, Year 10, is a monument of precise detail. Horses will be habituated to fire by firing pistols at the stable doors when they are being fed their oats. Take care to dwell for a pause between the shots at first, but as the young horses become more accustomed to the fire, repeat the pistol shots more frequently. Although these instructions were from the consular period, similar methods of training horses to cope with the various sights and sounds of the battlefield had been used throughout history. This of course took time, as did training the trooper who was to ride them into battle. Unlike with infantry, a cavalryman had to first be trained to ride before he could learn the maneuvers, and when combined with the time required to do both of these, as well as training the horse, it took considerably longer to put effective cavalry into the field than it did for the infantry. It takes threefold more time to teach a man to ride and to have perfect mastery of his horse than it takes a foot soldier his complete drill. The other problem caused by the Directory's rapid influx of new recruits was a serious shortage of equipment. Many in the cavalry had their firearms removed to be given to the infantry, whilst most regiments were lacking in equipment in one form or another, further reducing their effective strength. In early June 1793, the 9th Hussars at Amiens had only 136 sabres, 47 carbines, and 37 pistols for 533 men. An inspection report from the Army du Nord reveals the state of a number of other regiments at the end of June 1793. The 7th Dragoons, for example, lacked 439 helmets, 239 pairs of boots, 346 saddles, 302 bridles, and 352 bits. With all of this in mind, it shouldn't come as any surprise that the performance of the French cavalry in the early period of the Revolutionary Wars was fairly poor, whilst the lack of training for both horse and rider affected cavalry's effectiveness on the battlefield. The lack of firearms seriously hampered the light cavalry, as Lynn explains. The withdrawal of fusils and musketoons from cavalry and dragoon regiments, and the severe shortages of carbines in the light cavalry regiments reduced the French to impotence when faced by the well-equipped and able enemy skirmishers. On reconnaissance, the lack of firearms and the need for support cut into the cavalry's ability to maintain contact with the enemy and report their movements. In their first campaigns, the cavalry of the Allies surpassed that of the French in every particular. They may not, in every case, have made the best use of this advantage, but it is most indisputable that this superiority existed, and that the Allies had it. That the advantages they gained over the French in these numerous engagements were never attended with any decisive results on the campaign can be attributed only to bad generalship. Although towards the turn of the 18th century, the French cavalry had begun to regain some of its honour and reputation, and many capable commanders whose futures in the empire held titles and great deeds had begun to climb the ranks, it was to take a fairly complete reorganization for it to become the formidable arm of La Grande Armée. Napoleon devoted much effort to the expansion and improvement of the cavalry, long the weakest service arm. When Napoleon became first consul in 1799, he immediately set to work in reforming the army to his own ideals, building what was to become La Grande Armée. In particular need of care was the cavalry, and it was to this that he made large organisational changes over the next 5 years. He wanted 3 different classes of cavalry, heavy, medium and light, each of which would have a specific role, and we will now look at each of them in turn. Napoleon inherited from the Revolution 26 regiments of what were termed line regiments of cavalry, though they were effectively what is commonly known as heavy cavalry. These were the battle cavalry, big men on big horses, designed to break lines during battle. Unfortunately, as we have seen above, whilst they certainly were improving towards the end of the Revolutionary Wars, they were still in a terrible state, and Napoleon quickly issued changes for their improvement. In writing to Berthier, then Minister of War, "I desire you, Citizen Minister, to submit to me a scheme for reducing the regiments of heavy cavalry to 20, 2 of which should be carabiniers, all 4 squadrons strong. The last 6 of the now existing regiments should be broken up to furnish a squadron to each of the first 18 proposed regiments. Of the 18 regiments, the first 5 are to wear the cuirass, in addition to the 8th, which is already equipped in this manner, making in all 6 regiments with and 12 regiments without cuirasses." The cuirass had long been out of favour in French service, but with Frederick the Great's cavalry bringing it back into fashion half a century earlier, Napoleon wanted it to return to 6 regiments of his heavy cavalry. As Napoleon states, the 8th regiment had in fact always maintained the cuirass, and this detail was to cause a small amount of controversy in this new reorganisation. The numbers that regiments possessed was simply down to seniority, with the 1st regiment being the oldest. However, because the 8th had always worn the cuirass, its leader, Colonel Merlin, believed that they should now be renamed as the 1st and Senior Cuirassier Regiment, and a back and forth between he and Marshal Berthier took place, which ultimately failed and his regiment remained as the 8th. Colonel Merlin also expressed his opinion about the headwear of these new cuirassiers. To reward the 8th Cavalry for its conduct at Hochstadt, General Moreau had awarded the regiment 10,500 livres for the purchase of helmets to replace their cocked hats. Merlin now suggested to the Minister of War that this type of headdress should be issued to all regiments of cuirassier. Although there was some pushback from other colonels, with some preferring the carabinier-style bearskin, Merlin's opinion was thus heeded and the cuirassiers adopted what was to become their iconic headwear. Although the general style was agreed upon, because each regiment was ordered to procure their own helmets, there tended to be subtle variations. What was standardized, however, was the equipment that the troopers would carry, in particular their sword, which was desperately in need of improvement. Since 1792, far too many sword types had been issued, and the majority of them were badly made. As part of his reforms for the cavalry, Bonaparte reduced the number of cavalry sword patterns to 4 and improved the quality control. The men of the heavy regiments complained that their new swords turned too easily in the hand, which resulted in blows being delivered with the flat of the blade. The artillery officer whom the Minister of War appointed to investigate these complaints reported that the Year 11 heavy cavalry sword might well turn in the hand of an effeminate man, but not in the robust grip of a French heavy cavalry soldier. As well as a sword, each trooper was also armed with a pair of pistols, though how many troopers had 2 or even a single pistol is debated. The cuirassiers did not have any form of carbine or musketoon in La Grande Armée period we are discussing here. Although stores captured in Vienna in 1805 were supposed to supplement the regiments with musketoons, they were never issued, and it wasn't until a decree in 1811 that cuirassiers were given firearms other than pistols. The carabiniers of La Grande Armée were not yet dressed in the famous uniforms which most associate them with, but instead retained their uniform from the Ancien regime, wearing neither cuirass nor helmet. Their bearskin headdress was, despite its both handsome and intimidating look, unfortunately not the best of designs, especially for cavalry. Being bereft of chin straps, the carabinier headdress of the period was the most unserviceable in the French cavalry. Although armed with both pistols and a straight sword similar to a cuirassier, the carabiniers also had a musket and bayonet. Contemporary illustrations depict carabiniers with long and short muskets, and for lack of any official information, we can only hazard that these are probably the Year 11 and Year 13 dragoon patterns, and the 9 artillery pattern. Both units of heavy cavalry were to be mounted in theory on the largest horses, measuring between 15¼ to 15½ hands high, and ideally they would also be darker horses, so either black, dark brown or dark bay. It would take until 1812 and the French to have the pick of Europe's horses for the full optimization and specification on mounts to take place, even going so far as to having different coloured mounts for each squadron, but during our period, for the most part the heavies were indeed mounted on large and dark horses. Despite their differences in equipment and uniform, both the cuirassiers and carabiniers were to be organised in the same manner. Each regiment was to have 4 squadrons, each squadron being divided into 2 companies, which could further be divided down into 2 troops for administration purposes. On the battlefield, however, the squadron was the smallest tactical unit most commonly used within the cavalry, and is comparable to the battalion for infantry. This is why on most orders of battle, infantry strength is listed in battalions, whilst the cavalry's is in squadrons. As well as sharing the same organisation, the carabiniers and cuirassiers also shared the same place in the cavalry reserve as part of heavy cavalry corps. For example, on the eve of the 1805 campaign, the 1st Corps of Heavy Cavalry contained 3 brigades. The 1st Brigade consisted of the 2 carabinier regiments, while the other 2 brigades contained 2 each of cuirassier regiments. Also attached was a company of horse artillery. The reason for grouping them together was because they held the exact same role on the battlefield, that of being the elite battle cavalry designed to charge at the key points and break the enemy's lines. They would usually be held in reserve to be unleashed at the appropriate, ideally battle-winning moment. Although Napoleon had originally envisioned having 20 heavy cavalry regiments for his Grande Armée, by the time it was to march off for its first engagements in 1805, further tweaks had been made. The 2 carabinier regiments remained untouched, but the other 18 regiments had now been reduced to 12, all of which had been changed into cuirassiers and given the cuirass. A shortage of horses also necessitated that each regiment was only 3 squadrons strong, and wouldn't be boosted up to their desired 4 until 1806 when Austrian horses had been acquired. The remaining 6 heavy cavalry regiments had been transformed into dragoons. The medium cavalry is what most, including Napoleon, classify the dragoons as, though actually specifying what their role was can be difficult. But before we delve into that, let's first go over their history and discuss what Napoleon wanted from them. The first French dragoon regiment was created in 1656, and the old regime put together 17 more before reorganization in 1791 brought the number to 20, with an additional one being added the following year. Once again, their service during the Revolutionary Wars was patchy, usually robbed of their firearms and often lacking quality horses, equipment and training. They could do little to compete with the superior Prussian and Austrian cavalry, despite their best efforts. Napoleon's reorganization in 1803 added an additional 9 regiments by converting 6 heavy cavalry and 3 hussar regiments into dragoons to take the total to 30. Although these converts retained their original attire for some time, by the opening campaigns in 1805 all 30 regiments were dressed in what we come to recognize as the traditional dragoon uniform. As mentioned in the previous section, at this point the French did not yet have free range of European horses, and therefore had to make do with what they could find. For this reason, the specification for the dragoons mount was the exact same as that of the heavy cavalry. The only difference was that the heavy cavalry would usually receive the darker coloured horses, whilst the dragoons took the remainder. Their organisation was also very similar to the heavy cavalry, with each regiment possessing 4 squadrons, each of which had 2 companies or 4 troops. Again, a shortage of mounts posed problems, and for the dragoons, the solution was the creation of foot regiments. Initially, at the camps at Boulogne, this was not seen as an issue, because with a planned seaborne invasion of Britain being La Grande Armée's initial purpose, ferrying horses across the Channel could prove difficult, and therefore each dragoon regiment was to dismount 2 of its squadrons to form 2 divisions of infantry. Each foot dragoon was supplied with a pair of shoes, a pair of long black gaiters, a greatcoat and a haversack, to which his riding boots were tied. The long, heavy cavalry cloaks and any saddles and harnesses were packed into baggage wagons and dispatched to Boulogne for the prospective crossing. However, as the army's priorities shifted and looked towards mainland Europe and war with Austria, this organisation was changed. Horses were still in short supply, but like the heavy cavalry, the dragoons possessed enough for each regiment to remount one of its squadrons, giving it 3 mounted and 1 dismounted. These dismounted squadrons were once again grouped into infantry battalions and would spend the opening campaign as foot regiments. They had enough men to create a division of 7,200 men and 10 cannon, split into 4 regiments, each of 2 battalions. However, once success against the Austrians brought in captured horses, the regiments were soon remounted. Although in the campaign against Prussia the following year, Napoleon would reform 2 regiments of these foot dragoons by using the men left behind at depots, once Prussian horses were acquired, these 2 were quickly disbanded. The historian Beccari concludes that these foot regiments, which proved to be wildly unpopular with the men, were only ever designed to be temporary, never being seen again after 1806. The morale of the troops was low, and they consequently shaped up rather badly, marching abominably and executing poorly the everyday functions of infantry from lack of both practice and goodwill. The sole benefit derived from the foot regiments was the fact that the enemy eventually paid for their mounts and, with the end of the campaign, the regiments were disbanded and the individual squadrons sent to rejoin their respective mounted regiments. If this is the case, and the dragoons performed so poorly on foot, what then was their purpose? Because to most minds, including the emperor's, these men were supposed to be mounted infantry, trained for both cavalry and infantry combat. This was to enable them to play a flexible role, and in theory, to ride ahead, dismount, and then defend the position, something which was almost impossible for traditional cavalry without artillery or infantry support. However, there were several obstacles and problems to this idea. Firstly, training a man for the cavalry already took long enough, and adding infantry training on top of that only increased it. Secondly, it must be remembered that muskets relied primarily on weight of fire rather than accuracy, and because a squadron was much smaller in manpower than its equivalent in the infantry, dismounted dragoons were at a numerical disadvantage in this aspect. Thirdly, and adding to this, once dismounted, the horses become a burden, with perhaps 1 man in 6 having to mind them and keep them ready for their colleagues to quickly remount, further decreasing the unit's foot strength. Captain Nolan comes to the same conclusion. It would be less numerous than a real infantry corps opposed to it. The long swords and spurs of the dragoons would be in their way, particularly of skirmishing, and should a few of the enemy's light horsemen make a dash at the led horses, the dragoons would run a good chance of becoming only infantry for the remainder of the campaign. The desire for this style of mobile warfare should very much be applauded, but the practicalities of the period made it difficult to achieve. It is perhaps why during the American Civil War half a century later, when rifles are more common and the muskets more accurate, that dismounted cavalry actions are more frequent. Of course, the improved accuracy of both infantry and artillery weapons also blunted the potential for cavalry's traditional shock roll, perhaps forcing them to fight dismounted, but I'm getting off topic and I'm certainly no expert on the period. The point is that, given how unpopular the foot regiments proved to be, it would seem that the dragoons thus saw themselves as cavalry only, and not as mobile infantry or a combination of the two. My own reading suggests that this is also how the French utilised them, especially once enough mounts were available. I'm sure that there are specific examples of dragoons dismounting for small skirmish actions, but in almost all of the major battles in which they were involved, they fought in the saddle and acted in the same role as the heavy cavalry, as pure battle cavalry. Disqualifying them as mobile infantry, the next line of thinking is that the dragoons were supposed to be flexible cavalry, able to operate equally in either a heavy or a light cavalry role. However, I do not believe this to be the case either, for they bore neither the correct weaponry nor the training, officers, or suitable horses to enable them to excel in a light cavalry role. Firstly, to discuss their weaponry. Although they were armed with a short musket or fusil, this did not signify a light cavalry role, because as we've seen above, the carabiniers were likewise armed, and the Cuirassiers would follow suit in 1811. Therefore it is their sword which better suggests their role. The French cuirassier sword was designed to deliver the coup de poing with the weight of the heavy cavalryman on a charging horse behind it, and did so with terrible effect. But against enemy horsemen at close quarters it was much less effective, because its weight, length and centre of gravity made it difficult to parry with. The dragoons were also armed with a straight sword, and it likely possessed similar strengths and weaknesses. The straight sword was designed to utilise the point via thrusts, and was therefore less useful at parrying or slashing. This is important because on the battlefield, as we will see later on, much of the cavalry combat involved formation fighting, and each horseman had little chance to show off his individual prowess with either blade or horse. Therefore the thrust, which offered longer reach and the higher chance of causing a casualty, was the preferred method for this style of combat. In contrast to this, actions during what the French called la petite guerre, or small war, were very different. Light cavalry, such as hussars, chasseurs à cheval, and chevaux légers, were often called to fight an enemy force in the countryside during the day-to-day actions of the campaign. These were spontaneous actions that could occur on any type of terrain and under many different circumstances. Here, actions were much more the result of unexpected encounters and involved smaller parties, and so they were more frequently settled by individual efforts as opposed to the mass charges so typical of the battlefield. Slashing techniques were more likely, and to accommodate this, light cavalry was almost universally given sabres, which had a slight curved blade suitable for slashing. These smaller engagements also tested horsemanship, and for this reason smaller, more manoeuvrable horses were preferred. As we can see from the horse sizes above, the dragoons rode large horses, not suitable for this style of action. Although out of our current period, there is a good example of this during the Waterloo campaign. After the Battle of Lynn, General Excelmans, a fine and experienced cavalry officer, had his division of dragoons used by Grouchy in a reconnaissance role during the pursuit of the Prussians towards Wavre. Whilst they were able to accomplish their task, Excelmans was very unhappy and complained that neither his men nor his mounts were suitable to such a role. In a postscript to his report to Marshal Grouchy, he added, "I have informed your Excellency this morning that my men are exhausted. This tiredness is due to the service that the dragoons were obliged to conduct last night, and one is not able to demand that they do this as well as light cavalry, for they hear almost nothing and wear out their horses very quickly. This makes me feel that there is a necessity of attaching a few squadrons of light cavalry to a corps of dragoons. I request your Excellency give some thought to this proposal." It would seem then that despite Napoleon initially desiring them to be mounted infantry, and despite the term medium cavalry suggesting a certain flexibility between the heavy and light roles, that the dragoons of the French army functioned purely as battle cavalry. A legitimate question then would be, If they were armed with a similar sword to the heavies and served in an identical role, why were they not, or are they not, simply classed as heavy cavalry? Whilst the weight of the horse and rider is certainly one factor, the men and later the horses were not as literally heavy as the carabiniers or cuirassiers. When divisioned either with heavy cavalry or even in their own dragoon divisions, they very often were treated as heavy cavalry. Very often one sees corps containing either mixed or exclusively dragoons as reserve heavy cavalry corps in French orders of battle. However, I think that there is another factor which prevents the French from simply labelling dragoons as heavy cavalry, and thus scrapping the term medium, and that is that Napoleon viewed his cuirassiers and carabiniers as very much the elite wing of the French cavalry outside of his guard. This is shown in an exchange between, once again, Colonel Merlin and the then Minister of War Marshal Berthier. The Marshal responded to Merlin's request that elite companies of the cuirassiers should don white horsetails in their helmets to make them stand out. Berthier said that since the cuirassier regiments constituted an elite corps, they could not, by definition, have elite companies. Therefore, the regulation of 18th Vendémiaire was in no way applicable to the French heavy cavalry. When one consults the regiments of dragoons, it can be seen that they do still possess elite companies, and therefore, if we apply the logic of Berthier here, then the dragoons were not seen as elite cavalry. Thus, the distinction between the classes of cavalry remains. Therefore, as a side note, perhaps the term medium cavalry, due to its misleading nature, should be abandoned. Although in no ways my own invention or idea, perhaps the label line cavalry would be a more apt term to describe the dragoons and their later lancer cousins. The eyes and ears of the army, flamboyant and usually arrogant, these were the smallest men upon the smallest horses, yet often their egos made up for any deficiencies in height. Jokes aside, these horsemen were vital to the Grande Armée's success, both in screening its movements and in pursuing the defeated enemy, acting as both the advanced and rear guard of the army. They were divided into two types, the hussars and the chasseurs cheval, and although they both might beg to differ, for all intents and purposes they were identical in everything but uniform. The chasseurs were the indigenous light cavalry of the French, and numbered only 12 regiments in 1789, but the necessities of war had seen this doubled to 24 regiments 4 years later. In comparison, the hussars at the opening of hostilities in 1791 numbered only 6 regiments, but by 1795 a further 7 had been added to bring the total to 13. This was the number of hussar regiments throughout the Empire period, at least until the 14th were created in 1814. This rapid increase in the number of light cavalry regiments was indicative of the requirement of their role in scouting and reconnaissance for the army, a role which, although vital, did not require the same style of training in formation fighting as did the dragoons and heavy cavalry, hence why most conscripts were thrown into the light cavalry. Unfortunately, once more, their performance during the revolution was not great, but again it wasn't all their fault. As mentioned above, the removal of their firearms to be given to the infantry severely hampered their capabilities in the small-scale day-to-day skirmishes which determine much in the War of Information, and the role still required competent leaders and good horsemen, neither of which the limited training the revolutionary conscripts received could provide. By the time that Napoleon was first consul, the light cavalry numbered 37 regiments, 24 of which were chasseurs, with the other 13 being hussars. They were to be organised in the same fashion as the previous 2 branches, with each regiment containing 4 squadrons, each 2 companies strong. Bucari does say that the chasseur regiments could consist of 6 squadrons, and I do believe that I have seen this to be the case somewhere, but looking through the orders of battle for the major battles of La Grande Armée period, they only ever reached a strength of 4 squadrons. The difference between the light cavalry compared to the other 2 branches was that their squadrons were larger. Looking at the following table, one can see that not only does a light cavalry squadron contain more troopers, almost a third more, but it also contains more officers, more NCOs, and twice as many trumpeters. This can be explained by the role that the light cavalry were supposed to occupy. When on reconnaissance missions or patrols, very often a squadron would be broken down into smaller subunits. Johnson states that the ideal size for a mounted reconnaissance was usually reckoned to be 12 to 15 men. Therefore, having more officers, NCOs, and even trumpeters enabled these smaller units to still have adequate leadership and communication. This fact also further shows that the dragoons were not designed for light cavalry duties of patrolling and reconnaissance, for they did not possess either the number of men nor the number of officers and trumpeters to break the squadron down small enough. As you can see, they do however have an increased number of NCOs compared to the heavy cavalry, and this is because the dragoons would very often also engage in outpost duties, where supervision by sergeants would be necessary, but the leadership of an officer was not required in the same way as it would be when on patrol. In terms of equipment, the light cavalry were armed with a curved sabre and a carbine or musketoon, and were also supposed to possess a brace of pistols, but again, like the others, it's doubtful that all the troopers possessed more than one, and even that isn't certain. Their horses were to be sized under that of the dragoons and heavy cavalry, and although shortages were again a problem, with many regiments only listed as having 3 squadrons on many orders of battle, Napoleon refused to cut down the number of regiments. He understood the important role that these troops would play in the campaigns to come. With his 3 main cavalry types specified and in the process of being organised, Napoleon made another vitally important change. In the cavalry, many of the ageing officers who owed their advancement to their ardent Jacobinism or their skill with the sabre were replaced by thrusting young men who could make their troopers perform most, if not all, of the 18 manoeuvres in the new drill book. Despite the bravado shown by several of the cavalry commanders promoted during the Revolution, Napoleon understood that the key to mass cavalry combat was discipline in both manoeuvring and maintaining formation, not just inspirational leadership. He wanted his cavalry to be controlled, disciplined, and able to conduct all the necessary manoeuvres required on the battlefield, and not just hastily charge whatever was in front of them. Many of the qualities that these new leaders possessed would become key to the success of the French cavalry, but before we dig into that, let us first examine some of these manoeuvres which the cavalry were required to perform. As line was the principal method of fighting for cavalry, it is unsurprising that most of the manoeuvres therefore involve the deployment from various columns into line. The first few involve deployment from a peloton column. Firstly, on the first squadron, by flank. The regiment could also deploy centrally from this type of column. It could also deploy upon any of its squadrons, and in the examples I show, it is upon the third, but I have to confess that these methods are based upon my own interpretation, because the figures in the books I've used cannot be accurate because they would mix up the troop order within the squadron. Therefore, I'm suggesting that deployment in this manner would probably have been done using one of the 2 methods here. Although mixing the troops in this manner may not have mattered, given how important it seems to have been to have kept the alignment of the squadrons, I imagine that the same was true for both the companies and troops within the squadrons. This was probably to allow officers to better know their unit's placement within the regiment. By performing a mirror image of the central deployment, so with the leading 2 squadrons breaking to the left instead of the right, and the 3rd and 4th squadrons performing an about face, the regiment could deploy facing the direction from which it came. Finally, for this form of column, if it was approaching perpendicular to the desired deployment position of the line, then a simple pivot could be used if approaching from the left, or an overlapping manoeuvre if approaching from the right. There is an excellent example which I will highlight later, showing the advantage that could be gained by such a small detail as deploying via the first method rather than the second. The other form of column used by the French cavalry was the colonne serrée, or closed squadron column, and its deployment into line could be done in one of the following ways. Because the formation was dense and the intervals between the squadrons too small for pivoting manoeuvres, the line was deployed using a method not too dissimilar to that Gilbert advocated for the infantry in similar closed columns. The other method of deploying from this closed squadron column involved the column being perpendicular to the desired orientation of the line, and its squadrons had to expand the distances between them before they could pivot into line. The French appear to have one principal method of converting a line into a column, This can be found only by examining the École de l'Escadron à Cheval and is not addressed in the regimental manoeuvring section. The method that Nafziger describes involves a 45-degree pivot with the right flank peloton marching forward and each successive peloton falling in behind it. Although the regulations only list this one official method of ploying into column, Nafziger suggests that there would of course be another method, which would be the fastest way of both ploying and deploying. That was simply pivoting the companies or squadrons 90 degrees to form either the line or the column perpendicular to the other. Whilst the cavalry of the Ancien regime would perform these or similar manoeuvres at the halt or the walk, Napoleon wanted his cavalry to act swiftly and decisively, and thanks to the 2 years spent in the training camps around Bologna, they were able to conduct most of the manoeuvres at the trot or even at faster paces, and there are many examples throughout the period of La Grande Armée of this taking place. Despite this, however, none of these manoeuvres were particularly unique to the French, nor, so far as I am aware, did they pioneer any new methods of manoeuvre, as did their infantry compatriots. When one consults the cavalry tactics of the other nations, similar or even identical methods of both ployment and deployment can be found. Therefore, the success that the French cavalry were about to see during the period must be because of factors other than these manoeuvring techniques. Before we discuss those, however, it is important to first look in more detail into the nature of cavalry combat generally. The control of larger formations was the decisive factor in cavalry tactics. As mentioned previous, the line was the primary fighting formation simply because it brought the most sabres to bear, and it also enabled the widest possible front, negating as much as possible the chance of being outflanked. Cavalry were vulnerable to flank and rear charges much more so than infantry, because turning horses to face a new threat required more space than it did for men on foot, who could simply pivot on the spot towards the danger and present a new face rather rapidly. It will also be noted that in the animations above there is actually a gap between the squadrons when in line, and this was intentional for cavalry. Initially, when fighting the Turks, the Austrian cavalry did deploy in a fashion known as en morale, with no gaps for fear of them being exploited by the superior yet more individualistic Turkish horsemen, but by the time of the mid-18th century, this method had gone out of fashion. From the 1740s onwards, it became usual to place the squadrons within each cavalry regiment close together with 10 to 30 paces between one another. This distance was small enough that the cavalry were functionally a continuous line. On the other hand, there was enough space between the squadrons to allow the frontage of each to expand during the advance, thus avoiding overcrowding of the horses which led to the disordering of the line. This configuration was by far the most commonly used type of line by Napoleonic times, and en morale had been basically discarded. Once deployed into line, the cavalry could conduct their attack in several ways, not just advancing as a single line, although that very much was a possibility. One such variation was the echelon attack, which if conducted by a single regiment would involve one of the flank squadrons setting off first with each subsequent squadron following at about a 100-yard distance. The idea was to attack in a series of waves upon a smaller front, and in particular it was to be used against infantry, whereby the first few squadrons were supposed to draw the fire of the enemy, allowing the latter squadrons to charge in against infantry now caught in the process of reloading, and thus standing a higher chance of breaking. Against cavalry, however, this method was usually avoided, as each individual squadron could be easily outflanked and surrounded, and thus defeated piecemeal. A similar tactic to the echelon attack was known as the échec attack, and it involved the squadrons forming in a checkerboard formation. Usually used to offer a fighting withdrawal, perhaps as part of a rearguard, the idea here was to allow the forward squadrons room to retreat, whilst the rear squadrons had room to charge forward to support this action and keep the enemy at bay. The advantage of both of these methods was that each squadron, effectively acting on its own, would have more potential to maneuver onto the flanks and rear of the enemy, rather than being stuck in a rigid formation. This, of course, does not mean that linear order was the exclusive attack formation of cavalry. There certainly are examples of attacks in column or even loose order taking place, particularly when there was an opportunity of an immediate attack, and wasting time deploying would rob the attackers of any surprise or advantage. Kellerman's charge at Marengo is a great example of this. Nafziger also suggests that the column could be used when attacking enemy infantry formed in square. When one examines a cavalry attacking an infantry square, some of the reason for using a column becomes quickly apparent. A typical Russian battalion formed in square had a frontage of 50 men, or approximately 86 feet. A cavalry squadron of 100 troopers formed in 2 ranks had a frontage of 50 men. If 3 feet is allowed for the width of the horse and rider, we find that the cavalry squadron would have a frontage of 150 feet. The overlap is tremendous. If the cavalry regiment were formed in line, it would miss the target square with all but approximately half of one squadron. Whilst I do see his point, it should be remembered that a regiment of cavalry is not equal to a battalion of infantry. To quote Napoleon, a squadron is to cavalry what a battalion is to infantry. Therefore, it is more likely that a regiment of cavalry would be attacking perhaps a brigade of several infantry battalions, each formed in squares, or even combined into a much larger regimental square. However, if they did stumble across a lonely infantry battalion, then certainly column attack was a possibility, though more likely, and Nafziger does acknowledge this, the squadrons would simply attack in echelon. There is, however, one very interesting use of column as an attack formation. The column attack, which in the wars of the French Revolution were frequently used by the French cavalry, after 1804 was used only against infantry in column and was employed against heavy cavalry. It is to the latter part to which I am referring, and it was a method used particularly by light cavalry when facing off against enemy heavy cavalry. In individual combat, the nimble nature of the light horseman would likely give him the edge over his heavier counterpart, but in the formation fighting that usually took place in larger engagements, the size and weight of the heavier horse holds all the advantage. Therefore, in an effort to counter this, light regiments were advised to form dense columns and to fight their way through the enemy lines so as to negate the formation advantage as much as possible. If they could breach the enemy line, the light troops were to once again utilize their maneuverability and to quickly swing in behind the ranks of the heavies. Light cavalry charged by cuirassiers was usually overthrown. Caught in such situations, de Brac recommended rapidly massing the light cavalrymen into one or more closed columns to break through the enemy's line by sheer weight, then to wheel and take it from behind. Generally, however, linear order was the preference, and again, as with the maneuvers, all of these various methods of attack were well known and utilized by the various nations, and were by no means exclusive to the French. As a final note to this section, I'd like to discuss the use of firearms, particularly the carbines and musketoons. Generally, they saw much use between light cavalry patrols, but as we know, both dragoons and the heavy cavalry were also armed with carbines, despite them not taking part in this petit guerre. One method of their use was when skirmishing. Very often, even heavy cavalry would send out troopers ahead of their squadron to both assess the terrain and to skirmish with the enemy, attempting to draw infantry into a premature fire, or perhaps to just snipe at officers. The historian John Elting suggests that this latter method was useful against artillery. If you were suffering from artillery fire and could not for some reason charge the guns, one solution was to send out mounted skirmishers to take pot shots at the gunners with their carbines. The enemy would advance his mounted skirmishers to force yours back, and his artillery would cease fire to avoid hitting them. However, there is one firearm tactic that the French did appear to utilize seemingly much more than other nations. There are several recorded instances where French cavalry chose to receive a charge standing and firing a defensive volley before the charge struck them. In every historical incident read in preparation for the writing of this study, the standing cavalry was unable to stop the attack with its defensive volley and was broken by the charge. However, since this was done so often by the French over so many years, it begs the question, why, if it apparently always failed, did the French continue to attempt this? I think that the obvious answer to this is that it must have worked, otherwise they would not have continued such a seemingly suicidal practice for so many years. Nafziger is right in stating that most of the examples do tend to show the practice failing, but there are a few successful ones. One such example took place at the Battle of Friedland by the cavalry of 9th Corps commanded by Baron de la Ferrerie. There, his cavalry awaited the enemy with carbines presented and their swords dangling from their wrists. The resulting volley proved to be sufficiently devastating that the enemy cavalry retired before completing his charge. Nosworthy lists a few more in his book, and I have even stumbled across one whilst researching another topic. In recanting the final charge at the Battle of Waterloo, which was made in pursuit of the broken Middle Guard, Lieutenant Anthony Bacon makes the following remark in his letter to Siborne. The charge of the German light dragoons is precisely what took place upon our right front before we charged. The French dragoons waited for them as I have described, and received them with a volley of carbines. The Lancers do not carry those arms. The German line was checked by this fire, and we passed them before we came up with the troops in our front. With this example coming at the very end of the period, it goes to show that not only was the practice still in effect, but it was also effective, hence why it was continued to be used. Although more popular with the French than with other nations, this volley method was not really a key to their success. But to discover what was, we must first dive deeper into the different opponents that cavalry faced upon the battlefield. In a previous video discussing the importance of morale, I tackled the myth that cavalry simply rode over enemy units, smashing through lines as we often see in Hollywood blockbusters. As dramatic as it looks, in most cases this simply never happened. A horse cannot be forced to run into a line of spiked bayonets any more than it can a brick wall. It has a mind and a will of its own, and very often the horse, and the rider, would pull up before any contact with the enemy was made. If infantry were caught in the open and individually, then of course a horse could and would knock someone to the ground, but generally, if in formation and presenting a solid wall of bayonets, the cavalry will pull up. Victory does not always depend upon the superiority of the arm, but upon 1,000 other things. That the courage of the troops, the presence of mind of the commanders, the opportunities of manoeuvres, the effect of artillery and musketry fire, rain, mud even, have been the causes of repulses or of victories, and finally, that a brave man, whether on foot or mounted, will always be more than a match for a coward. This then gives the advantage to the infantry, for if they could maintain their formation, they should in theory be unbreakable by cavalry. However, there are countless examples of cavalry defeating infantry throughout history, and especially during this period. Therefore, something had to change for this to take place. Experience showed that steady infantry could always repel a frontal cavalry charge. Successful cavalry action was only possible if the infantry had previously been subject to adequate artillery fire or if their morale was shaky. All are agreed that a general attack of cavalry against a line in good order could not be attempted with much hope of success, unless it be supported by infantry and artillery. Infantry that has been shaken by a fire of artillery or in any other way may be charged with success. The key point here is that for cavalry to be successful against infantry, then the correct timing was crucial. They had to catch the infantry out, perhaps while they were shaken from fire, when changing formation, or simply being unaware of the close proximity of the cavalry, particularly to their flank or rear. An example being the Battle of Hohenfreiberg in 1745, where a well-timed charge by the previously mentioned von Seilitz and his heavy cavalry turned the battle in Frederick's favour and won the day. The Bayreuth dragoons had displayed again the decisive tactical effect that cavalry shock action and mobility could still add to infantry warfare. Against unwavering infantry, their charge might have been suicidal, but against foot soldiers already wavering, the swift and awesome onset of horse could turn fright into panic. Probably the most famous example from the Napoleonic period is that of the British heavy cavalry routing the infantry of de Erlon's corps, catching them in a moment of disorder and completely unaware as to the presence of cavalry. A perhaps more appropriate example for this video is that of Kellerman's charge at the Battle of Marengo. Seldom in history has there been a more successful cavalry charge. The Austrians were caught completely off guard. Not only did they not see the French cavalry approach, being totally preoccupied with the French infantry they were hoping to crush, but they were defenceless, or so they thought, having nothing but empty muskets and no longer in completely closed order. Whilst against infantry, the cavalry commander required an understanding of timing. When facing enemy cavalry, other factors came into play. Frederick the Great, understanding the importance of morale, had implemented a charge doctrine for his cavalry, which is widely believed to be the most effective, and I think too many people mistakenly believe that this was the go-to doctrine for all cavalry during the Napoleonic period. The idea was that the troops would begin the charge at the walk, then after a certain distance they would trot, then eventually, when close enough to the enemy, they would sound the charge and break into a full gallop. Whilst this method did see his cavalry to much success during the middle of the century, by the time of the Napoleonic Wars the game had changed and better cavalry officers had seen the folly in this method. General Lasalle, probably the greatest light horse commander of the period, when seeing the enemy approaching at the gallop, would often describe them as lost men. This is also an area in which I believe Captain Nolan is mistaken, and that he misunderstands the nature of mass cavalry combat. He had learnt his trade in the east, where the Turks and Mamluks displayed fabulous, almost virtuosic riding, and very often speed and individual prowess was their emphasis when charging. It is therefore unsurprising that he takes a poor view of the French cavalry during the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon's horsemen were not at home in their saddles. They were heavily equipped and could not move with speed. He therefore formed them into very large masses, and used deep formations for attack. Thus his cavalry played a secondary part to the artillery. Its movements were cramped, its approach necessarily slow, and, as it was always heralded by its own cannon, the enemy was seldom taken by surprise, except at Marengo, but had time to prepare a reception which cost the French masses of horse very dear. Still his horsemen, mostly clad in defensive armour, were poured on slowly but in irresistible numbers, and thus, regardless of the loss of life, Napoleon by their means won many a field. This is unfortunately a false and naive view of the events that took place on Napoleonic battlefields, for the French's charging at the trot was one of choice, not necessity. Although the charge at speed did give an initial boost of morale to the attackers, as well as present a fearsome sight for those facing it, if the defenders could overcome this initial fear, then the morale factor actually switched and it placed the galloping troops in a dilemma. The reason for this is that once again the same logic applies as it did when facing infantry, in that a horse nor its rider will not willingly smash into a wall of enemy horses. Therefore, whichever side could maintain formation would have a distinct advantage, and thus, as Nosworthy aptly puts it, though offering an initial advantage, the charge at the gallop also contained the seeds of its own destruction. This is because maintaining formation at the gallop was practically impossible. The horses naturally have different top speeds, and just generally keeping order at such fast paces is difficult. Therefore, when faced with a resolute and tight formation, the galloping horses, having nowhere to go, would be forced to pull up, veer away, or simply turn about. A troop at the gallop sees a massed squadron coming towards it at a trot. It is surprised at first at such coolness. Galloping men do not reason these things out, but they know them instinctively. They understand that they have before them a moral impulse superior to theirs. They become uneasy, hesitate. Their hands instinctively turn their horses aside. There is no longer freedom in the attack at the gallop. Some go on to the end, but 3/4 have already tried to avoid the shock. There is complete disorder, demoralization, flight. Then begins the pursuit at the gallop by the men who attacked at the trot. It would seem then that Nolan's impressions upon the French's lack of speed being a problem, and his own belief in following Frederick's methods, are false. Although Nolan could claim that I am no cavalryman, nor was I even there, someone who was there was Jomini, and he comes to a very similar conclusion. If the enemy advances at a fast trot, it does not seem prudent to gallop to meet him, for the galloping party will be much disordered, while the trotting party will not. The only advantage of the gallop is its apparent boldness and the moral effect it produces, but, if this is estimated at its true value by the enemy, it is reasonable to expect his firm and compact mass to be victorious over a body of horsemen galloping in confusion. In their charges against infantry, the Turks and Mamluks showed the small advantage of mere impetuosity. However, no cavalry will penetrate where lancers or cuirassiers at a trot cannot. It is only when infantry is much disordered or their fire poorly maintained that there is any advantage in the impetuous gallop over the steady trot. Although the final point is referring to cavalry attacking infantry, the same held true for purely cavalry engagements, perhaps even more so. As another side note, this is why the lance is incorrectly regarded by some as a poor weapon. Many, including Nolan, rightly conclude that it is, even in the hands of a veteran, a cumbersome weapon and no match for a competent horseman armed with a sabre, for once the point is beaten, the lancer is as good as dead. However, this was not the purpose of the weapon. It was not designed for one-on-one duels, but for formation fighting, as a wall of horsemen armed with lances is something no man or horse would willingly ride into, nor stand and face. It is also an excellent pursuing weapon given its reach. But as the French didn't adopt it until later, I'm getting off topic again. Now that we have seen what cavalry actions on the battlefield look like, what exactly was it that allowed the French cavalry of La Grande Armée to become the dominant and feared force that it was? I think there are a few factors that set them apart from the other nations, one of which we have already mentioned above with their preponderance of charging at the trot and thus maintaining formation. Although this wasn't a method exclusive either to the French nation or even to their own combat doctrine, they did appear to utilise it with more regularity than others, and it often did them very well. However, there was much more to cavalry against cavalry combat than simply maintaining formation, and as engagements grew larger, other factors such as positioning and the timing of reinforcements become of greater importance. The tactical employment of cavalry on the battlefield had several governing rules. Whilst its main effect was in its shock action, Napoleon cautioned that it is not only its velocity that ensures success, it is order, formation, and proper employment of reserves. As mentioned earlier, cavalry was extremely vulnerable to flank attack, and therefore in larger engagements, the idea would often be to support a frontal attack with one on the flank. It would become a tactical battle of who could maintain their reserves until last, because the final squadrons thrown in would most likely be able to fall on the flank or rear of the enemy without fear of reprisal. Of course, it is not as simple as being the last one to engage wins, because there is little point in holding squadrons back if the squadrons that you do engage are immediately overwhelmed and defeated. It was therefore a delicate balance of timing, understanding the terrain, judging the enemy's intentions, and it all required much skill in its execution. In a great example from the Battle of Würzburg in 1796, we see this type of cavalry chess match take place. The whole of the French cavalry had been united at this battle under the command of General Bonneau. The cavalry of the Austrians met them close to Emsfeld and drove in their skirmishers. Bonneau, seeing the imperial cavalry gradually increasing in numbers, thought it best to charge without loss of time. The French fell on with resolution and drove back the left wing of the Austrians, who retired on their reserves. In the meantime, 14 squadrons of hussars burst forth from behind a village and galloped in on the rear of the French, who were simultaneously attacked in front by the German cuirassiers. The remainder of the French cavalry were then thrown in to the rescue, but the Austrians held 12 squadrons still in reserve, and these decided the fate of the day. The French were driven off the field, pursued behind their infantry, and 2 battalions of the division Grenier were afterwards destroyed by the victorious Austrians. Although humbled in this example, by the time of the Empire the French had become masters of these engagements, with both Wellington and Napoleon each acknowledging as much. Napoleon considered that although 2 Mamluks could outfight 3 Frenchmen, 300 French could defeat an equal number of Mamluks, and 1,000 French overthrow 1,500 Mamluks. I considered our cavalry so inferior to the French for want of order that although I considered one of our squadrons a match for 2 French, yet I did not care to see 4 British opposed to 4 French, and still more so as the numbers increased, and order, of course, became more necessary. They could gallop, but could not preserve their order. As Wellington identifies, once the numbers increased, order and formation became key, and it was here where the French always seemed to hold an advantage over their adversaries, especially the British. But how was this advantage achieved exactly? I think that there are 2 key factors, the first of which historian Nafziger in his book Imperial Bayonets shrewdly identifies. It was a small practice within the setup of a French cavalry squadron compared to that of other nations, and it offers a valid reason for the French's ability to maintain their formations during these complex tactical affairs. If we look at the setup of a French heavy cavalry squadron, we can see that there are officers and NCOs placed in key locations on all 4 faces of the unit. This placement effectively boxes in the troopers, essentially guiding them during combat. The French system provides a large degree of control on every flank and face of the squadron, thereby ensuring that it should behave as desired in battle and that once it has completed a charge, it should rally more quickly. To put this into better perspective, let us take a look at first a British squadron and then a Prussian one. As you can see, both squadrons, despite having a similar number of officers and NCOs, have only one of them in front compared to the French's 5. By having multiple junior officers in the front ranks, the French system relieves the squadron commander of the need to worry about alignment or control of the front ranks. Instead, he can keep his focus mainly forwards, keeping an eye on the enemy, observing the terrain, and also setting the pace. The junior officers behind him can keep the men in order and prevent them from riding ahead. In comparison, the leaders of both Prussian and British squadrons do not have this luxury. The British have only the squadron commander in front. This system, like the Prussian system, provides little forward control over the front rank of the squadron and has the squadron commander attempting to do too much by himself. The French system of placing officers in front of the front rank of the squadron allows them to keep the troopers from losing their heads and charging off in the heat of battle. The loss of forward control was a historically frequent occurrence with the British cavalry. I think then it is fair to say that the French system was clearly superior and offered the greater control, and it is no surprise that they were able to not only maintain their formations during combat, but also to reform much quicker after a failed charge, both important components to cavalry warfare. However, as interesting and valid a reason as this certainly is, I do think there is another reason for the French's success, and that is leadership. If we turn back to Captain Nolan, we can see what he defines as key to a good cavalry officer. With the cavalry officer, almost everything depends on the clearness of this coup d'oeil and the felicity with which he seizes the happy moment of action, and, when once action is determined upon, the rapidity with which his intentions are carried into effect. There is little time for thought, none for hesitation, and, once the movement is commenced, its successful accomplishment is the only thought allowed to pass through the mind of the commander. Coup d'oeil has, to my knowledge, no direct English translation, as it literally means something like glance of the eye, but what it means in a military sense is very much what Nolan describes. It is the ability to judge a situation, assess the terrain, and thus measure distance and timings, almost in an instant. It is therefore vital for a cavalry commander when we remember how important timing was, particularly when facing off against infantry. It is a skill which, at least to me, seems to be one that is nurtured and honed via experience and practice rather than simply trained or taught. Certainly there would be elements that senior officers could pass on to their juniors, but generally it would be practice that makes perfect, and this is exactly what the French system of promotion through merit allowed. Earlier it was noted that Napoleon replaced many of the revolutionary generals with younger officers who better understood the manoeuvres, but these were also men who possessed this vital coup d'oeil. To handle mass cavalry required highly specialised skills and knowledge, including a deep understanding of what cavalry was and how much it could achieve, plus the ability rapidly to survey and evaluate the ground over which it would attack. This coup d'oeil was the rarest skill of all, exceedingly hard to acquire. Furthermore, it had to be combined with physical courage of the highest order and superb leadership. The outstanding horse generals of Napoleon's army had all these qualities, as the men whom they led well knew, and it was this utter confidence in his leaders, coupled in many cases with his affection for them, that enabled the average French trooper to rise above his far from brilliant horsemanship and his imperfect discipline. Kellerman is perhaps a perfect example of this. Clearly, by his conduct throughout the wars, he possessed this coup d'oeil, and it was this, along with several other important factors of leadership, that allowed him to rise through the ranks. When a young lieutenant colonel of hussars named François-Étienne de Kellerman was cashiered on the grounds that he was a gentleman, he immediately rejoined as a trooper, and within 8 months had worked his way back to lieutenant colonel. As well as promoting these officers, the French system also gave them the freedom to utilise their coup d'oeil upon the battlefield. Whilst this advantage was not as pronounced as it was in the infantry, where French battalion commanders had much more authority and initiative granted to them than an allied officer of similar rank, in the cavalry this difference still existed. Although allied cavalry commanders very often were given a certain freedom to act, it was not at the level of the French, and as we know, these small differences in timing can, for cavalry, be the chance of catching infantry unprepared, or perhaps the opportunity to fall upon the flank of an opponent, or to put it simply, the difference between success and failure. Therefore, perhaps Nosworthy's small conclusion regarding the French cavalry might be true. The French were mediocre horsemen and had to rely on techniques that were based on the skill of the officers and the quality of their judgment rather than on pure horsemanship per se. Another minor factor that could be mentioned is the method of warfare utilised by Napoleon himself. If we again turn to Nolan for his opinion on cavalry, we find a few interesting passages. Cavalry can seldom effect anything great when the armies to which they are attached are acting on the defensive. When the general's objective is to maintain himself in the field only, he takes up positions from which it is difficult to dislodge him, but in which the cavalry can only act partially in repelling the attacks of the enemy. In defensive warfare, it has seldom achieved great deeds, for to act a passive part in war is contrary to the spirit of cavalry tactics. Though a more in-depth discussion will take place in the video on grand tactics, it is clear that Napoleon, as well as many of his marshals and generals, were offensively minded, particularly during this period. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Davout at the Battle of Auerstadt conducted the engagement in an offensive manner, and of course, Napoleon's masterpiece at Austerlitz showcased the ability to switch an initially defensive stance into an offensive counterstroke at the key point of the battle. This style of warfare was perfect for cavalry, and it is little surprise that under Napoleon, many notable commanders came to the fore and went on to achieve great feats of arms. The same can be said for the Prussian cavalry under Frederick the Great. There are many examples of great cavalry actions during this period of La Grande Armée, which helped the French to take the mantle as the finest cavalry. For want of time, I will not go into too many examples, but I will try to give each branch of the arm an example to show their roles. The first example is the one that I teased earlier, and it shows both the impact that small-scale cavalry tactics and manoeuvres can have on an engagement, as well as the freedom of French cavalry officers to even defy the emperor. The engagement took place in 1807, 2 days prior to the infamous and bloody Battle of Eylau. The Russian rearguard, commanded by Barclay de Tolly and consisting of 12 battalions of infantry as well as some cavalry, had decided to delay the French near the town of Hof, 17 kilometers southwest of Eylau. The position was a formidable one, with a small bridge across a ravine being the main point of engagement. Napoleon, catching up with Murat's advance guard, assessed the situation, and despite the dangers, immediately ordered an attack with cavalry against what he perceived to be the weaker right flank of the enemy. The chasseurs obeyed, and despite the canister fire, managed to cross the bridge in column before forming up in line to the left. Unfortunately, the Russians reacted quickly and were able to repel the chasseurs, sending them scurrying back across the ravine. Napoleon, not yet deterred, ordered a dragoon regiment to ride forward and attack the same weaker part of the line. Valiantly again, the dragoons obeyed, forming up in the same manner as the chasseurs before failing to break the enemy and falling back in the exact same fashion. By the time of their retreat, Soult's infantry, as well as de Houppol's Cuirassier division, had arrived on the scene. Whilst the terrain and situation may have favoured the infantry, Napoleon, as impatient as ever, ordered de Houppol to achieve what the chasseurs and dragoons before him had failed to do, break the Russian line. De Houppol, however, quickly assessing the situation, asked the emperor to allow him to attack the left flank of the enemy instead of the right. Napoleon, confused as to why he would want to attack the stronger section, nonetheless allowed his general the freedom to do as he wished, and so off trotted de Houppol to lead his Cuirassiers forward. The heavy horsemen thundered across the wooden bridge at the trot, bearing the canister in the same fashion as those before them, but instead of turning to the left, de Houppol led them to the right. The advantage of this decision was about to be seen as he ordered his men to form line. Now, instead of having to halt the regiment while each squadron formed up in the correct order, by approaching from the right, line could be formed by a simple pivot as each squadron was already in its desired order of battle. The trumpets rang out the order, and within moments line was formed without breaking stride. The suddenness of this manoeuvre caught the Russians out. Panic gripped them as the French cuirassiers were upon them much quicker than expected. Regiments began to break, and within minutes the momentum of the battle had completely shifted. The cavalry overran much of the infantry, capturing 2 standards, as well as helping to inflict around 2,000 casualties. The Russians soon began to withdraw towards their main army, whilst de Houppol and his men returned to their own lines to be greeted by a jubilant Napoleon, who declared the charge to be the most beautiful he had ever seen. The 6-foot general, upon dismounting his horse, was even embraced by the emperor in front of his men, whom he then thanked for enabling such an honour, before promising the emperor that he would now have to give his life for him. Unfortunately, he would do just that only 2 days later, falling during the great cavalry charge at Eylau. The Battle of Hof was not as simple as my animation here makes it look, as it did also involve infantry, but the cavalry charge of de Houppol's Cuirassiers did play a crucial role in breaking the Russian lines. It is also a good example of showing not only how small-scale tactics can give local advantages which can then lead to turning points in battles, but it also highlights the importance of the coup d'île, for it was both that, as well as his understanding of cavalry tactics, that enabled de Houppol to correctly countermand his emperor's orders. For the deeds of the light cavalry, one need look no further than the excellent job that they did in screening the army's movements during the Ulm campaign in 1805, nor in the relentless pursuit of the Prussians after Jena the following year, in which they played a key role. Napoleon was able to account for no less than 125,000 Prussian troops out of a total of 160,000 originally operating in Saxony, and of the further 35,000 Prussians and Saxons stationed elsewhere, not one succeeded in crossing the Oder to link up with the Russians at this stage. The charge of the 4th Hussars at the Battle of Friedland in 1807 is also an example of the light cavalry's ability to function as battle cavalry if required, and the number of battle honours won by the various light regiments throughout the wars is testament to this. To give the dragoons a highlight, there is a great example showing the importance of formations in cavalry versus cavalry engagements, as well as the tactical chess match which often took place during these encounters. It is given to us by the then General Grouchy during the Battle of Friedland in 1807, where he set up a magnificent trap for the enemy cavalry. Concealing his dragoons and light artillery west of Heinrichsdorf, Grouchy sent the light cavalry and Nonsort's division trotting towards a mass of Russian horse. On Grouchy's orders, the French regiments worked their way up to a slow gallop, then suddenly turned about and began to retire. The Russians pursued, losing alignment in the excitement of the chase. As they moved beyond Heinrichsdorf, Grouchy's dragoons took them in flank, whilst Nonsort's division turned to charge their front. Riding away in disorder, the Russians passed across the front of Grouchy's artillery, which showered them with grape shot. Finally, the historian Johnson offers us a good overview of the cavalry's performance during its first and arguably most famous major battle. With the exception of Kellerman's faux pas, it is extremely difficult to fault the handling of the French cavalry at Austerlitz. Whenever possible, flying artillery had prepared the ground for an attack. Halted regiments had been sheltered from enemy cannon fire, yet kept close enough at hand to take part in the action à propos. Although Nonsort had made his division charge en masse, with 2 brigades in line and 1 in support, he had kept firm control over his 18 squadrons. All other units had acted in lesser groups which were able to form up in a restricted area. Kellerman's light cavalry and Boursière's dragoons had functioned by brigades, each colonel keeping a tight rein on his regiment, the guard by detachments of 2 or 4 squadrons. Changing front, forming echelon, deploying into line, all these movements had been carried out at speed, and regiments which got into trouble had been given prompt flanking support. The cavalry of the old regime was a mess when it was inherited by the revolution, and the measures put in place by the Directory, though well-intentioned, did little to improve things. Though the Revolutionary Wars, particularly towards their end, did see the French cavalry begin to show promise of what was to come, it was to take until the days of the Empire for their reputation to reach its pinnacle. Thanks to changes put in place by Napoleon, as well as a period of peace that allowed adequate training, during the period of La Grande Armée, these veterans of the Revolution went on to become undoubtedly the most formidable cavalry in all of Europe, feared and respected by almost all who faced them. This they achieved through several methods. Firstly, they understood the importance of formation fighting, particularly during cavalry engagements, and by thus adopting a slower charge, at the trot and not the gallop, they maintained their formation and in many cases ensured success. Further to this, the structural organisation of the actual cavalry unit, more precisely the placement of officers and NCOs within the deployed squadron, was designed to give maximum control in all directions, and certainly gave them an edge over other nations who failed to do this. Finally, the revolution and the notion of promotion based upon merit truly allowed the cream to rise to the top for French cavalry officers. Perhaps never in the history of warfare had a cavalry arm been so blessed with so many brave, capable and well-loved officers. Names such as Murat, Montbrun, Kellerman, Lasalle and de Hooppol were not only masters of their craft, possessing an incredible coup d'oeil, but by leading from the front they helped to build an esprit de corps that inspired many a French victory. Until next time, thanks for watching.